This one's a little bit different, nothing to do with the coronavirus for once. I want to talk about sensationalism around high profile crime and particularly thinking of serial killers and high profile murder cases. Now, there is an exhaustive amount of material on this, so I'm just going to use some examples rather than be absolutely comprehensive, because it's something that I think is raises a lot of talking points. Um, Recent weeks, well, a few weeks ago, not in the last week or so, because my mind's been on the coronavirus thing, but in recent weeks, I have been kind of researching prominent, mostly American serial killers. Um, the channel Biopics covers quite a few of them. Um, some of the more famous ones, of course, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Ed Kemper, John Wayne Gacy are among some of the best known. Dean Corll, who was responsible for the Houston mass murders in 1973, at that time the worst in American history. When I was in China, I was reading reports coming through of Sam Little, who may be America's most prolific serial killer. Um, he's certainly in, he's high up there. Here in the UK, we are not totally devoid of it either. There's going to be an ITV adaptation this year covering the crimes of Dennis Nilsen, who often has analogies with Jeffrey Dahmer. He was a man who raped and killed vulnerable young men in London in the 1970s and 1980s, about 15 victims. Um, Here in Sunderland, we had our very own serial killer, Mary Ann Cotton, back in the 1860s. She killed husbands and children to get sort of insurance money, and that was actually dramatised in a program called Dark Angel. And of course, Britain is home to arguably the world's most famous serial killer, or at least the first high-profile serial killer case never solved. Of course, I'm referring to Jack the Ripper. There's many other cases in the UK. So the amount of material out there is vast. I focus particularly on the United States and the United Kingdom as there is a lot of source material available, but other countries have their fair share. Germany has had its cases, the unsolved Hinterkaifeck murders, which was featured on the Bedtime Stories channel. And Peter Kürten, the so-called Vampire of Dusseldorf, who was a serial killer back in the, I believe it was in the 1920s. Russia's had quite a few, so there's cases all over the world. It does seem, though, that the United States has more than its fair share, even allowing for the fact that it's got the world's third biggest population. There does seem to be an exceptionally high number in the United States. I mean, is that in the 1970s alone there was three different freeway or highway killers operating in California in the 70s and 80s alone. So, in other words, different serial killers with the same nickname but different people in different cases, which is quite incredible. And of course, the unsolved Zodiac case. So, if you look online, there is a huge amount of interest in this. There's supposed to be a new film in the works. Of course, coronavirus sets everything back. But a biopic about H.H. Holmes, Leonardo DiCaprio was supposed to be in the role. The famous case during the Chicago World Fair involving the serial killer H.H. Holmes, who probably didn't kill as many people as he claimed, but nevertheless does rank as one of America's most notorious early serial killers. Um, and then you get cases which aren't serial killers, they're individual murders, but they're high profile. An example of this would be the Oscar Pistorius case of the 2010s in South Africa. And there's cases all over the world that attract a particular amount of interest. It could be because of particularly sensitive cases, maybe involving child murder, um, maybe involving a high profile defendant, um, like well, there's many cases. O.J. Simpson, of course, in the 90s. Phil Spector later on. So there's many examples and there's a vast amount of source material. I have to be honest, I'm not really a huge fan of crime programs in the sense of, I mean, they're very popular in this country. There is a huge amount of kind of fictionalized crime programs from Inspector Morse to Inspector Lewis to Vera to Grantchester to the Inspector Wexford mysteries. It's not all about murder, of course, a lot of it's other kinds of crime, but it's a very popular genre in this country. Then there's true crime, which is documentaries or dramatizations of actual crime cases. Um, and the UK has produced a fair few of them. I have to say, I've seen both American dramatizations and British dramatizations, and I have to say, call me biased, but I think the British dramatizations are overall less sensationalized the way they're handled. Um, for example, See No Evil was a dramatization of the murderers, who were a couple that killed five children in Greater Manchester in the 1960s, and they're infamous in this country. Um, So, although it didn't gloss over their crimes, it wasn't overly sensationalized. And like I said, there's a new dramatization of the crimes of Dennis Nilsen. A for Acid, or A is for Acid, about the crimes of John George Haig, the acid bath murderer. And then back in the 1970s, there was a dramatization of the crimes of John Christie, called 10 Rillington Place, so named after the murder location, starring the award-winning Richard Attenborough. Very atmospheric, very chilling adaptation. In the post-war years, Notting Hill, where the crime took place, was quite a slum, really. Today, it's quite an affluent area, but back then it was kind of a post-war slum. And that case was particularly notorious because Christie saw an innocent man hang for the crimes that he committed, but he was convicted 2 years later and hanged himself. This was the murder of 8 women. There's many other cases in Britain. I could talk all day about these cases, but what I want to focus on is the nature of sensationalism. Now, I'm not saying that all American adaptations or productions about serial killers are in bad taste or overly sensationalized, but I do think it is something that kind of taps into American culture. And this was actually part of the sort of the story arc of the film Natural Born Killers, the Oliver Stone film 1994, starring Woody Harrelson and Juliette Lewis, kind of a modern day Bonnie and Clyde, a couple who basically went across the country state by state, causing mayhem, you know, violent bank robberies. It's a very strange film. I'll always remember it for the hauntingly beautiful Leonard Cohen intro, Waiting for the Miracle, which just worked beautifully in that film. So, well, beautifully, but also hauntingly, because the way it was done was not just a straight song and desert scenes. You had kind of these blood red scenes. It was very, the choreography of that film, or I should say the cinematography of that film was very unusual. I still don't know what I think of the film. I still can't quite decide whether I like it or not. Um, but anyway, what Stone was touching on, and Stone is not without its controversies. I'm quite critical of some of Stone's politics. However, I do see what he was pitching at with that film, that it's kind of ironic, a country that takes pretty hard line crime on first degree murder. I mean, in the state of Texas, you know, it's in mandatory death penalty. For a country that does take a pretty hard line on that, the United States also has an obsession with serial killers and turns them into celebrities in a way that no other country does. I'm not saying that other countries don't have sensationalism. I'm not saying that a killer in India or Russia or France won't get, you know, tabloid headlines as well. They will. But there's something particularly American about glamorizing killers in that way. And yet, that doesn't mean the American people are bad. It doesn't mean that they're more desensitized or more. I'm not sure that's the case. The average American, you know, knows these guys and women are, they see it for what it is, but there is nevertheless that sensationalism there. And I do think that's a particularly American phenomenon. Again, I'm not saying it's unique to the United States, but I do think it is very notable there. By the way, I'm not saying that we don't have sensationalism here. However, it's more in the print press. I mean, my goodness, the Sun newspaper, the way they handle sensitive cases is very, very sensationalistic. And I can quote many examples, but well, a topical example of this was Steve Wright. He was a man convicted of murdering five sex workers in Suffolk in 2006, and that became known as the Suffolk Strangler case. And the tabloids were all over that, and some of it was pretty insensitive how they handled that. Um, you know, I think the danger is twofold. Firstly, you can glamorize the criminal, you can turn them into a sort of cult figure of sorts, and you can also run the risk of forgetting the humanity of the victims, particularly if sex workers are involved. And in the case of both Jeffrey Dahmer and Dennis Nilsen, one theory in those cases, and more recently there was a guy called Stephen Port who killed four men in London. He was called Grinder Killer um, for gay men. There is a theory that the victims were kind of seen as it sounds harsh, but almost expendable because they were runaways, they were vulnerable, they were gay. Um, Certainly back in the 70s and 80s, society, not just the police, but society in general, were more conservative than they are now. So the idea of no one, frankly, would have, this is going to sound harsh, but there just wasn't the same sort of public interest in that sort of crime as there would in, say, a little blonde girl. Um, so there is a real social phenomenon with that. And again, in the Dahmer case, a lot of the victims were African Americans. Some of them were petty offenders. Some of them were kind of drifters. So sadly, you do get cases where um, the profile of the victims means that there's almost less public sympathy, and that's really sad. Um, Juan Corona is another serial killer in the United States. I think it was either Arizona or California, I can't recall. I think it was late 60s or early 70s, can't recall. But he killed a lot of migrant workers, but they were all middle-aged men. So he's kind of been forgotten in history. But he ranks among America's worst serial killers in terms of number of victims. I think it was well over a dozen victims. Like a lot more than that. I think it was over 20. But most of the victims were middle-aged men, so that is never going to have the same sort of social impact as, say, young teenage girls. It's just not, rightly or wrongly. That's just the way it is, unfortunately. Um, it's just human nature. And talking of human nature, there is a degree of hypocrisy in all of us. I mean, anyone who I fully admit I have an interest in that dark side of human nature. I'll watch these documentaries. I'll go back to them. I find them very interesting. And yet the moral side of me says this is horrible. What these guys do, these are monsters. This is horrible. And yet there is that side. We keep going back to the interest. It's always, always there. Because rational people think no normal person can do those things. No normal person can do the sort of things that Ed Kemper done, brutally rape and murder young women, and then, you know, be so callous about it, be so indifferent to it. Although in his case, a lot of that came back to the abuse he suffered as a child from his mother, who was basically an extreme misandrist. Um, and it goes without saying often in these cases, not universally, because I don't think you could say there is a uniform blanket profile of every serial killer, but very often you do get a situation where there is real childhood trauma events or an abusive parent. Now, I'm no psychologist, I'm not pretending that I am, but it does seem to be a trend. So, in the case of Ed Gein, and in the case of Ed Kemper, and I think Gary Ridgway as well, but don't quote me on that, quite a few male serial killers, particularly those who target women, what you find is they sometimes come from a background where there was an extremely fanatically religious mother, particularly mother, um, who express extreme misogynistic tendencies and kind of portray portrayed all women as whores. So that means the boy grows up desensitized to women being human beings. Um, and it leads to this psychology where they see their victims as not living sentient beings, but pieces of meat, to put it bluntly. And that's what's so horrendous about it. And it's why child abuse is so disgusting and so wrong, because you don't know what sort of future damage you're doing. And again, I'm not saying this is the case with every serial killer. But anyway, I detract. Um, I find that with true crime, you get I can't say they're all the same. I feel that some true crime documentaries are handled in a much more professional and sensitive way. For example, Top Fives and Bedtime Stories, I give those guys credit because I think they handle sensitive cases in a professional way. They don't gloss over the details, they give the full details, but they do it in a sensitive way. Insofar as they're not overly sensational, so they're not saying, then he brutally raped the victim. I find that some channels are a lot more sensationalist in the way they do it. And you see this in popular culture. I mean, Family Guy, the famous cartoon Family Guy, has sometimes touched on crime cases, and I find it can at times be in pretty bad taste. Now, I don't consider myself a prude. I'm not square when it comes to humor. I can appreciate dark humor, but sometimes I think Family Guy goes too far. I think it is just sick. Because what creators of these sort of mediums need to remember is even if they think they're attacking the defendant or the criminal, kind of making mockery of a real life crime, particularly one that's happened in recent years, to me that's disrespectful to the victim's family. And I do take issue with that. I like Family Guy. Well, I've kind of mixed feelings about Family Guy. Sometimes I find it very funny, but when it deals with, for example, real life murder cases or criminal cases, I kind of cringe. I'm thinking, Seth MacFarlane, you're being a dick. You're just being an insensitive dick. I mean, this is maybe detracting a bit because it's not to do with serial killers, but I remember one episode which I found frankly revolting just in its insensitivity. And it was about the Terry Schiavo case, which was controversial euthanasia debate in the United States. And yeah, he kind of turned that into an episode, and it was just I thought it was an extremely bad taste, and I think the Schiavo family was right to take action against the show for that, because free speech and this actually comes into the whole debate about how these cases are handled, because free speech comes into everything. But I do take the view that where you're dealing with real life cases where there are living people, covering it is one thing as a journalist, as a documentarian, as a filmmaker. But if you're setting out just to mock a crime, a real life case where people have really suffered, I've no respect for that. And I don't think you can hide behind comedy or free speech. I mean, legally you may be able to, but ethically, I think, you should be called out for really being insensitive. Now, that brings me to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because of course this famously covered the Manson murders. But if you've seen the film, you'll know, spoiler here, spoiler. So yeah, in the end of that film, instead of the Manson cult brutally murdering Sharon Tate, her friends, and the Bianca family, and the Bianca couple, they have Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio turning on the Manson gang, and it's typical Tarantino violence. It's a very violent scene. But in that version of events, the murders that we know of never happened. And Tarantino would say this is his way of kind of giving some, not closure, but some respect to Sharon Tate and the other victims. But the interesting thing about that is if you look at it on the surface, you might think it's in bad taste. These were some of the most notorious murders in American history. So for Tarantino to come in and make a film out of it is, well, that's just exploitative. However, when you find out that Sharon Tate's family, I don't know about the other families, but her family fully approved of the script, because Tarantino, through Margot Robbie, humanized Sharon Tate. He gave her life rather than just showing her as a victim. He showed her as a young actress, living her full life, and in that sense, the film is doing something different. So I do think it's important to understand what angle a director is taking. Sam Peckinpah back in the 70s was also accused of excess violence, but the aesthetic of violence in film is something that I think creates a lot of interesting talking points. When it comes to high profile crime and murders, I do think there is exploitative angles, and I do think, for example, Family Guy has occasionally done that, where there's no sort of intelligent message. There's no sort of, well, this is what we're doing with it. It's purely mocking the situation. It's purely, you could say it's gallows humor, but to me it goes beyond that. So, I mean, if we look at the United States, the way that, for example, televised trials has always been the thing there. In England and Wales, not Scotland, but in England and Wales, trials are always conducted. You have an illustrator who would actually draw the defendant. It's quite old-fashioned. Now, I've mixed feelings about whether we should televise trials or not. My concern about it, on one hand, it would be transparent because people would say how judges reach their conclusions. Certainly, that's something I've called for more transparency from judges, more public accountability in that sense. My concern about televised trials here, though, would be, and this has been seen in the United States. I mean, the O.J. Simpson thing was a circus, and the same with the Michael Jackson trial and a host of other trials. They just become circuses. And then you get a situation where it becomes trial by media. And I think at times the media's behavior is disgraceful. Um, Actually, in one of our criminal cases, I think it was in the case of John George Haig, the so-called acid bath murderer, the editor of the Daily Mirror actually went to prison because he described Haig as a murderer before the outcome of the trial, thus prejudicing the trial. He actually served 3 months in prison for that. The editor of the Daily Mirror, excuse me, at the time. So this is a real issue of journalistic ethics, reporting the news, reporting the facts versus sensationalizing something. And I think all self respecting journalists need to be very wary that they don't merge into the latter. Then it becomes a sort of circus. And is it really about public interest or is it just about exploiting a tragedy? That would be my contention. So let me know your thoughts. I think there's always going to be interest in this. I think that the dark side of human nature is always going to interest people. And I'm not playing holier than thou here, or at least I hope that's not how I'm coming across. Because I'm guilty. I watch these documentaries. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in these cases, and I've watched a lot of them. But I also try to remember there are human beings behind this. And I think it's very important that criminal proceedings don't get turned into a circus for two reasons: respect for the victims, but also to ensure that a potentially innocent person doesn't get an unfair trial, so that they do have due process and not trial by media. That is an extremely dangerous thing, trial by media. And especially with over the where cases that there's a particular sensitivity, such as child murder, it's extremely important that the press is responsible and not demonize someone before they've been found guilty, because those sort of crimes are very, very emotive for understandable reasons. So that's why I think the press have to handle these things well. And as for filmmakers, and I mean, really, sometimes you can scrape the barrel with this stuff. I saw a B movie, I didn't see it, but I've heard of it. Dahmer versus Gacy. And you can't get much. The thing is, though, it didn't take itself seriously. It was trash, and it knew it was trash, and it didn't pretend to be anything else. So, unfortunately, some cases are always, always going to be forever in the public eye. They're forever going to be infamous. And I'm interested in the Jack the Ripper case of Whitechapel murders. I've studied it extensively. From Hell is pretty sensationalistic as a film, but it's still, what can I say? It's a watchable film the way it's made with Johnny Depp and Heather Graham. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. Let me know your thoughts. particularly thinking of serial killers and sensationalism. Serial killers, high profile killers, and sensationalism. I think that the interest is always going to be there, but personally, I am always going to gravitate more towards the documentaries that I feel are done in a more professional way. I mean, you can never gloss over these crimes, you can never gloss over the details. I do think that the way they are approached, for example, I really like bedtime stories as a channel and top fives because I think they handle these things without whitewashing them. They don't gloss over the details, but they do them in such a way where they're not just being exploitative, in my opinion. For example, I think both channels, top fives in particular, will even put out numbers to contact the police in missing person cases and so on. So I give them credit for that. I think they handle it in a responsible way. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.